And welcome everyone. This is Accepted Academy event with our very own Shelley. And this is Why Do We Live in Cities? A Brief History of Urbanization. I'm very excited for this. I took a urban history class last semester, so this is going to be, time things for me. And yeah, Shelley, welcome. Thank you for hosting this. And the mic is yours. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for coming today. I'm really excited to talk about this question of why do we live in cities? So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am. So my name is Shelley. I live in beautiful Portland, Oregon. I am a professional urban planner, credentialed through the American Institute of Certified Planners, which basically means I took a ridiculous test. I'm also an independent researcher, and I'm really interested in housing planning and policy, especially on the West Coast of the United States. That is a really important area to figure out right now. And then I'm also really interested in urban governance in Latin America. Um, I have master's degrees in city and regional planning from the Ohio State University, if you know, you know. And then a question that I often get is what I think the best city is, or what I think the most well-planned city is. And my answer to that is always some variation of, well, it depends on what you mean by best or most well planned. But I will say that the coolest city that I have been to is Lviv, Ukraine. And it's the largest city in Western Ukraine. Its settlement dates back to the 5th century. And the reason why I think Lviv is so interesting is because it is a really incredible example of the relationship between politics and urban form, right? And when we say urban form, we mean what the city actually looks like. What do the buildings look like? How does the space interact with the people in it? And that relationship between politics and the form of a city is a really important concept that we're going to be talking about today. So, I want to go back just a little bit to my undergrad. I actually majored in philosophy, so I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. And if you ask people who study philosophy what philosophy is, you're going to get a different answer from each person. But for me, I think a pretty good definition of what it means to do philosophy is to ask two key questions. The first one, why are things the way that they are? And the second one, why aren't they otherwise? And it turns out these are really great questions to ask about cities because the form of a city is so ubiquitous that we don't really ever have to think about it, right? We see these kinds of images and we think, yeah, this is what a city looks like, right? This is what a city is. This is what a city does. It has buildings, it has roads, it has people, it's laid out in a certain way, and we never really have to think about why it's like this and what it could possibly be if it were different. A really good example of this is a lot of times we don't realize just how much of our urban environment, how much of the built environment serves cars specifically. A 2025 study in the Journal of the American Planning Association found that roadways constitute 22% of all urbanized land in the United States. And then an analysis by the Parking Reform Network found that about 26% of land within central urban cores goes to parking lots. And this is one of those things where we hear that and we think, oh yeah, maybe that's not great. Maybe that's not awesome. And so being able to look at a city and ask, okay, why is it like this? And why isn't it some other way is really important when we think about what cities, how we could do things differently with how we design and manage and plan cities. So I want to start with um, something a little interactive. We're gonna do uh, a Mentimeter, everybody's favorite. So you can pull out your phone, or I think you can probably do this in your browser on your computer as well. If you go to menti.com, menti.com, and enter this code, or you could also scan this QR code. So I'll just give you about 20 seconds to get set up with that. Okay, great. So our first question, where do you live? So you should have the option to drop a little pin. A lot of people on the East Coast, the United States. A lot of East Coasters. It must be a good time right now. Oh, wow. Very cool. Got West Africa. More East Coasters. Got someone in Europe. Very cool. Cool. All right. So we are internationally represented in this group, which is great, which makes me really interested to hear your answers to this next question. Whoops. What do you like about where you live? So this one, I'm not sure if this one is, I think this one is you're given 100 points and you can allot that 100 points to these different categories. So what is it that you like about where you live? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So far, our winner is being near family or friends. So social connections. Yeah, access to the natural world. Mm-hmm. Got to be able to afford it. Give it just another minute or so. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, being able to not have to use a car. And then is there anything that you can think of that you really like about where you live that isn't on this list? You can put that in the chat. Oh yeah, the Menti link for folks just coming in. Yeah, if you go to menti.com, you can see that code at the top of the screen that I'm sharing to plug that in. Oh, access to an international airport. Yeah, there you go. College town. Weather. Oh yeah, that's yeah. I live in a part of the country that is notoriously very rainy, and gray, this time of year. And it's a common joke to say that we moved here for the weather. Lots of business opportunities. Yeah. Yeah, economic opportunities. Cool. Very cool. So the next question is related. What do you not like about where you live? And this one's an open-ended question. Either everybody's thinking or nobody can think of any reason why they don't like where they live. Oh, interesting. Okay. University town. Yeah. Yeah. Slows down in the summer. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It takes a while to get around. Not close to kind of the cultural or entertainment kinds of things that would be nice. Uh, Not good public transportation. That is a very, very common complaint. More access to nature and the outdoors. Cost of living is high, cold, rainy winters, far from family. Oh, people aren't friendly and they don't pay attention to bikers. That is a universal that is a universal problem, I fear. So I'm wanting to ask these questions because I want us to start kind of getting in that mindset of thinking about cities, thinking a little more critically and a little more deeply about what is this place that I live in and why do I live here and why don't I live somewhere else? The weather changes every 5 minutes. Yes. Yes. Um, right, because I want us to think about uh why do we live in cities at all, right? Like if there are things that we don't like about cities, why are we here, right? Why aren't we somewhere else? So, um, let me get back to my slides. So it's that big question, why are cities like this? Right? Why are they like this? And why aren't they like something else? So, why does this matter? Why is this important? Um, well, I think there are two key reasons why this question is important. The first one is that we are continuing to urbanize as a species. Even though there is no globally agreed upon definition of what urban means, generally we know that urbanization has been exploding since the Industrial Revolution, since the turn of the 20th century. And we're pretty certain that the number of people worldwide who live in urban areas surpassed the number of people in rural areas around 2007. So, very relatively recently, especially when we're thinking about the scale of human history, that is extremely recently that we have become majority urban living as opposed to rural living. Um, and the rural to urban migration has occurred mostly in the last 200 years. In 1800, fewer or less than 10% of people globally lived in urban areas. And in 2024, about 58% of the global population lived in urban areas. And this percentage is expected to rise to 70% by 2050. Um, and then the second reason that I think it's important to ask, why are we doing this in the first place? Why are we living in cities in the first place? Is because there are some aspects of living in a city that kind of suck. We talked about some of them. You guys answered gave your answers of what are some of the reasons you're not super jazzed about your where you live. One of the big ones is disease, right? Areas with higher population density tend to have higher rates of transmissible disease, right? And then this gets amplified when we're talking about air quality and water quality. Cities are also huge drivers of social stratification. Multiple studies across a variety of disciplines have found that sociospatial segregation, at least in the United States, based on economic status, has actually gotten steadily worse since 1940. And as we've urbanized, social stratification has gotten worse. Um, there's also environmental effects of urbanization. There was a 2011 huge, robust meta-analysis of research on the environmental effects of urbanization, and they begin with their conclusion. Their first sentence is kind of a punch in the gut. The conversion of Earth's land surface to urban uses is one of the most irreversible human impacts on the global biosphere. So, that's not great. Um, and so I think it's important that we ask the question, why are we doing this in the first place? Why are we living in cities? What are the things that drive us to want to be an urban living species, right? And how can we keep all of that? How can we maintain that while trying to mitigate some of these negative effects of urbanization? So, I want to go through three key theories to explain why we live in cities. So, the first one, and probably what is the most commonly accepted, is agriculture, right? So, humans became humans about 300,000 years ago. And for the first 294,000 of those years, we lived in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies. Any permanent settlement we had wasn't really that permanent. We lived extremely nomadic lives, and we didn't really settle down in any one place for too long. And then it was only about 6,000 years ago that we started building cities. So it's only in the last 2% of our evolutionary history that we went from our first permanent settlements to the kinds of urban living and urban phenomena that we're familiar with today, right? That is an extremely relatively short period of time for humans to have evolved from starting to live in permanent settlements to all of the intricate ways and all of the nuanced ways that we live in and relate to cities today. So, uh, it's the general consensus that what changed was our species shift to cultivating food rather than hunting for it. Um, and our earliest permanent settlements were ones that had the best conditions for agriculture. So they were temperately mild, they had really good soil quality, and plenty of access to water. So in the Americas, um, Mesoamerica and what is now Peru were the earliest settlements there. In the Middle East, we have Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, and then in Asia, the Indus River Valley civilization and the Yellow River Valley civilization. That these were the first areas that we started to settle, and that the historians who believe that agriculture was the primary driving force of urbanization would say that it's not a coincidence, that these are the areas that have the best conditions for agricultural development. So there's a few implications of agrarian settlement that are important to note. The first one is, okay, when we started growing food and staying put, we just had the capacity to make more of us. when we weren't constantly moving and when we were able to have a more predictable um, diet, um, we just had the capacity for much larger populations of people. We also had the ability to store food and other goods, and by extension, the ability to trade food and other goods. And then these settlements, these agrarian settlements, also led to the division of labor, right? Which created social stratification because that's when we started developing these different classes based on who did what labor. And this one right here is of particular interest to the historians who consider the form of the city, right? The pattern of urban development, which cities today continue to follow, to be driven fundamentally by markets and economies. And that's because, according to people who, adhere to this theory of urbanization, all of these development patterns in cities come down to the fact that the physical distance from a central marketplace became quantifiable in terms of cost. So if you lived further from the marketplace, it was more expensive for you to bring your goods to the market. So these natural concentrations of people began to develop, with populations becoming more dense, closer to marketplaces. Um, and this is a really important theory to explain why cities, even cities developed in completely independent civilizations that had no contact with each other, they followed really similar development patterns. And a notable example of this was 16th century Spanish colonialism in the Americas. So in the 16th century, this is what the Spanish would recognize as a city. This was a map, a drawing of Toledo, Spain, which is one of the oldest Western European cities. Um, and some of the things you might notice about this, we have the larger buildings in the middle. And there's specifically the structures to facilitate government and religion and commerce. And then the structures become smaller and more spread out as you leave the city until they dissipate into the countryside. And then everything is connected by a series of established roads, a road network. And so when the first Spanish colonists arrived um, in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztec Empire, they documented that Tenochtitlan was extremely similar as far as its urban form went to the cities that they were used to. Um, right in the middle, you have the large central buildings for government, religion, and commerce, and then decreasing density and decreasing intensity away from the city center, and then everything connected by a network of established and maintained roads. Um, and there's an archaeologist, Monica Smith, who studies ancient cities. And she wrote this, although everything they heard and smelled was new, what the Spaniards saw as they approached the Mexican highlands was nonetheless utterly familiar. Their ability to read the landscape of population and productivity prepared them for the appearance of a city. And they were right. When they arrived at the place the locals called Tenochtitlan, they knew exactly what they were looking at and how it functioned. So there's a really good argument to be made for the idea that, okay, humans live in cities because we started growing crops, right? Because of agriculture. Um, but even granting for for that, I would argue that agriculture was necessary for the development of cities, but it's not sufficient to explain it, that there's something else there. And there's two big reasons. One is that there's actually a 6,000 year gap between the development of agriculture and the development of cities. So we spent a long time growing crops and raising animals without necessarily turning that into the development of cities. Um, and then the second reason is that cities do something for us beyond just trade. And we know that that's true even in ancient cities, even in the oldest cities. And so agriculture might be a major factor for why we started living in cities, but we know that there are cultural and religious and social reasons for um, why we decided uh, to live in cities, to be an urban species. And so that brings us to the second theory that I want to talk about, which is power. So, um, you'll remember that I mentioned that urbanization led to a significant increase in the number of total people on the planet, and that labor specialization led to social stratification and social hierarchies, right? That labor specialization led to social classes. And there have been a few different theorists, particularly in the 20th century, who have talked a lot about this. So there's one guy, Lewis Mumford, wrote a book called The City in History, where he looked at this idea called economic determinism. And economic determinism is what I was talking about previously, that the reason why cities look the way they do is because the closer you are to the city center, the cheaper it is to bring your goods to market, right? And the farther away you are from the city center, the more it's going to cost you to bring your goods to market. And so that's why cities look the way they do. That's why they're so concentrated in the middle, and then they dissipate as they leave that central spot. And that theory is called economic determinism. And Lewis Mumford said, no, actually, I don't think that that's right. Rather, he argued, using evidence from historical cities, that the development of cities depended on the emergence of chieftains or kings who centralized power and entrenched those social hierarchies. And then this emergence of power brought with it all of the conceptual significance of all of the cultural symbols and social institutions and shows of strength that characterized early cities. So it was this relationship between the concentration of power and the development of cities that Lewis Mumford said was really crucial. There was another guy, Henry Lefebvre, who wrote about this concept that he called the social production of space. So, um, he said that space, right, specifically spaces of human habitation, so cities, aren't just physical containers of buildings and roads and plazas and temples, etc. Rather, this kind of a space, right? So a city is a product and a means of production. Specifically, the production of space is directed by those in power as a tool to reproduce and fortify their power. So, in this book, The Production of Space, he wrote, in addition to being a means of production, space is also a means of control, and hence of domination and of power. And there's an example, a city that I want to talk about here that I think represents this idea pretty well, and that's Medellin, Colombia. Medellin is a really fascinating city from the standpoint of urban planning and urbanism. So, um, Medellin has a really interesting development pattern where it developed what we refer to as formally. So it developed, according to formal government processes in the city center, But as more and more people started moving to Medellin through the 20th century for more economic opportunity, there wasn't enough space in the formal, you know, government planned parts of the city. And so people started building these what are called informal settlements up in the hills of Medellin. And so it ended up with this interesting development pattern where you had the people who were wealthier, the people who had more social and economic power, living in the established, um, state-sanctioned parts of the city, whereas you had the people who were economically and socially disempowered and disenfranchised, living in the periphery. And Karl Marx said something really interesting where he said the social relations of capitalism are more clearly and sharply observable at the periphery of the system than at the center. Right? So it's the periphery of Medellin that tells us about how power is concentrated in this city. And it goes back to what Lefebvre said about how the spaces in which we live are means to reproduce that power. And I know that I don't know, I just need to acknowledge it's a little cliche, it's a little tropey to, to talk about this. Um but I think it's a good theory. But again, I think it's incomplete. I think it's an important and necessary component of why we live in cities, but I don't think it's the whole picture. And so I want to talk about the third theory, which is complexity. So a few years ago, I started getting really interested in complexity science, and systems theory. And um, because my background is in, philosophy and public administration and public policy and urban planning, um, and the fact that complexity science gets really mathy really fast, there's a lot of it that I don't understand, and a lot of it that I'm still trying to understand. And so, in the spirit of learning in public, I'm letting my explanation of this section sort of represent, instead of like a super polished, uh, you know, um, kind of diagrammatic explanation of how this fits. I instead want this to be more of representing kind of the messiness of how I'm trying to think about this. So, a little introduction to complexity science. So, I'm not going to get too in the weeds on this, don't worry. But complexity science studies how large numbers of interacting elements within a system produce collective behaviors and collective patterns that can't be understood by looking at the parts alone. And that is called emergence. And specifically, emergence is this idea that, in essence, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Um, and that a key element of this idea of emergence is that it's hard to predict. It's really difficult to predict what kinds of patterns or what kinds of collective behaviors are going to come from the interactions, the connections among elements within a system. It's really hard to predict, and that's why it's complex. So, in applying this to cities, to the ways that cities are organized, to the ways that we interact with each other and interact with the space around us in cities, we can think about how humans live in cities because dense settlement creates a complex adaptive system that produces these benefits like economic benefits, cultural benefits, safety benefits that can't emerge at lower densities, right? So we need to have some kind of critical mass of people in some kind of contained space, right? Concentrated in some way in order to see these benefits emerge from that system. And then we self-organize, right? That's another important element of complexity science is this idea of self-organization, that the elements of a system don't necessarily have to be centrally directed, but rather they're self-organizing through feedback loops and through network effects. And those feedback loops, very basically explained, are uh, this relationship between interactions and opportunities, right? The more interactions that you have among elements in a system, the more opportunities for emergence there are. And then when you have more opportunities for emergence, that creates the conditions for more interactions. And then the network effects are are important because the insight we get from that is that it's not even necessarily about the number of elements in the system. It's not even about the population of a city, but rather it's about the number of connections that are possible among um, among the people that live in the city, and not just the people, but the buildings, the space itself. And I think it's important to think about complexity as a key theory for why we live in cities, because I think it says something about what it fundamentally means to be a human, right? That we are both products of nature, but also have evolved to have these extremely complex forms of consciousness, right? Forms of decision making that I think complexity science can help answer. And so I want to wrap all of this up by um, uh, going back to that original point that I made about how um, I think it's important that we unpack the assumptions that we have about cities and that we recognize the things that we take for granted in cities. And think about, why are sidewalks this width? Why is everything built for cars? Why do buildings look like this? Why are things more dense downtown and less dense in the suburbs? Why are cities the way that they are, and why aren't they otherwise? And I think that that's a really important question to ask because so much of what it means to live in a city involves social inequality and social stratification, right? We go back to those negative effects of urbanization, the environmental effects, disease, social stratification. And when we make the connection that the existence of those kinds of things isn't it's not inevitable. It's not uh it's not something that's out of our control, right? That if we're able to ask ourselves, why do we live in cities? And why are cities like this? And why aren't they otherwise? Then we can start thinking about, okay, so then let's imagine a future in which cities maybe look different. Let's imagine a future in which we relate to each other and relate to the space around us in cities in a different way. And I want to end on that note with a quote from, um, I think, one of the most influential academic authors of the 21st century so far, David Graeber, who was an academic anthropologist. He passed away a couple of years ago. But this, I think, is one of the most powerful things that he wrote. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. So, I do have this list of sources. I'm happy um, to provide this, or I guess I could provide the slides on accepted society as well. Um, Yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks so much, Shelley, for this amazing talk. As someone, I'm from Latin America. I'm from Venezuela. I have,
Oh, cool.
yeah. So, hearing that you're very interested in Latin America made me think about this question. Um, you talk a lot about this third theory, that maybe explains like why cities are the way they are in a better way. But I was
Hmm.
wondering because you put Medellin there as a great example. I mean, I grew up going to Caracas maybe every week. And Caracas is one of those places that also has, what you call the informal settlements, but
Hmm.
people I think wrongfully say slums.
Hmm.
So how does this um third theory apply to cities like this? Because I do have coworkers from Africa as well, from Nigeria and Zimbabwe specifically, and they also, when we were talking about this, they were also like, yeah, that's also the situation at home, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I was wondering how specifically this third theory fits with the Latin America, and then what we call the a quote unquote global South.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, why or how does it fit specifically with those?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a really great question. And this concept of informal settlement throughout Latin America is, has been, especially in the late 20th century, a big question of what do we do with these spaces, right? These spaces that are sort of outside of the we could say control or jurisdiction or whatever of a government, right? How do we provide services to these places? Water, roads, electricity, internet. How do we provide services to these places that are not really part of the formal structure of the city? And I think that the answer comes from, I think we're thinking about things in the wrong order. There's a really famous urbanist from the United States. Her name's Jane Jacobs. She wrote a lot about New York City. And she said, there is no logic that can be imposed on cities. And what she meant by that is that, in my world for planners, we have this idea that it's like, okay, we want to have this like rational, controlled, governed space, and then we want people to play by those rules, right? We want people to fit into that. But in reality, the ways that we sort of formalize cities, the way that we govern cities, the way that we create policies, should instead respond to the ways that people are already acting, right? Respond to the ways that people are naturally wanting to organize themselves, right? And so instead of saying like, okay, you guys in this informal settlement, because you're not over here with us, being governed by us, then, you're not part of our city. But instead, I think we should look at it as like, no, this informal settlement is the natural emergence of all of these different variables that created this. And it's our responsibility as planners, as architects, as people in government to respond to that and to make sure that those people are being served in the best possible way. Right. So I think it's that idea of we have it backwards. Oh, I love this. How do you work with different government agencies when planning, such as the Port of Portland and PDX Airport? Great question. Um, so yeah, so I live in Portland. I actually have friends who work for Port of Portland. Portland is an interesting example because there are multiple governing bodies. We love government, I guess. Right, we have a city government, a county government, we have a regional government, and then we have these kind of little pockets of little jurisdictional things like Port of Portland, which is responsible for the airport. And then we have the state government. And this question of coordination is like the million-dollar question. Um, of how do we make sure that we're not duplicating efforts? How do we make sure that these different governing bodies stay in their wheelhouse without necessarily becoming too siloed? And this is really important because all of these different governments run on tax dollars. Um, yeah, and so this question, how do you work with different government agencies? I feel like that's something that we are always trying to figure out. That question of coordination and who does what when and where and with what money is something that we're always trying to figure out. Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
I actually do have a question.
Yeah.
So, so I think when you're talking about the aspect of like specialization and like, I think you said it was called social stratification or something like that. Because I live in it's like one of the two largest cities in Kentucky, Lexington. So it's like everyone comes to Lexington for opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I think that I've actually heard someone refer to certain cities as like upscale jails. It's like, yeah, it's costs a lot, but that's where all the opportunities are because
Yeah.
like majority of Kentucky is just rural areas. So people are just coming up to Lexington so they can go to University of Kentucky because that's where the schools are. That's where the hospitals are. So everyone's coming out of county to go to Lexington. So I guess like my question really is that like why is it designed that way to where it's like we want you to come here versus being in your own area, like especially when you need services
Yeah,
like
yeah, that's a great question. And that points to, the driving force of why humans are continuing to become more and more urbanized, right? Is because that is where the opportunities are in bigger cities, in urban areas. That is where the economic and the educational opportunities are. Um, And you're right. What happens a lot of times, people call it a brain drain, right? Where you have people who live in more rural environments or smaller towns who might have might be really skilled at something or could be potentially really skilled at something. And then they, go to a larger city for university or for a job, but then they stay there and then they don't return, right? And so what do you do with that? And there are a lot of different programs to try to intentionally redirect uh, some of that knowledge, some of those skills back out to less urban areas. I'm thinking specifically in Oregon, the um, or this might be a US thing. So there's an organization called AmeriCorps, which connects usually college students or young adults with opportunities with nonprofit organizations or um, really any kind of organization that could use the assistance of, a skilled, knowledgeable person, right? For some kind of disenfranchised or marginalized area or group of people. Um, and one of the programs that AmeriCorps runs is called uh, Rare Rural. Oh, I don't remember the name of it, but I know in Oregon, a lot of my urban planning friends have done this program where out of college, they go work for a period of time in like a small town or like a very rural county. And I think that's what it takes is those kinds of direct interventions, those kinds of direct programs to incentivize people back out to less urban places. Um, in order to try to combat those effects of like a brain drain. Yeah. Oh, Dalton asked, how can you contact me? I'm on Accepted Society. I'm currently working on setting up uh, probably a Substack talking about issues around urbanization and I don't know, all of my hot takes about cities. But I will for sure put that in on Accepted Society. Otherwise, um, I'm not on LinkedIn. I deleted my LinkedIn. I don't want a social media account about my relationship with capitalism. But I am on Instagram. Uh, let me send you, hold on, I gotta look up what's my username? Here we go. Okay. It's not really a professional Instagram, but I do post a lot of stuff about cities. Any other questions? Cool. Right on. Well, thank you guys so much. And then, just in the, for the sake of, knowledge sharing, information sharing, if you guys have any other thoughts on this topic or, some resources that you think I would be really interested in, yeah, reach out to me on Accepted Society or on Instagram. Oh, do I have any book recommendations on this topic? Yes. Um, yes. So, in fact, this book, which I quoted from, Cities, The First 6,000 Years by Monica Smith, is a very readable, very approachable, non-academic, book about yeah, why we live in cities, what we've done with the last 6,000 years of urban civilization. There's also another book that I recommend to everybody who is interested in learning more about urbanism. This is specifically more towards the United States. Well, it is really only about the history of urbanization in the United States, but it's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I think that's his name, but it's called The Color of Law. And it's about racial segregation in the United States and all of the policies, all of the planning tools that we have used historically in the United States to create racially segregated places in pretty egregious ways, and how the impacts, the effects of those policies are still very much alive today. That I think is one of the most important books to read in order to understand. Um, yeah, I'll type it in. In order to understand development patterns in the United States through the 20th century. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate this opportunity to tell you about cities.
Thanks so much, Shelley. And this recording, I'm gonna ask Kate and Kaylin, but I'm pretty sure it will be uploaded to YouTube or yes, I need to ask the what's the plan with that. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks so much, Shelley, for such a wonderful lecture. And yeah, I will also ask about sharing the slides, and probably you can share that bibliography with us, or like at the end of the slides, there's also a lot of sources there.
Perfect.
So yes, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Shelley.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
See ya.